Mr. Pod and Mr. Piccalilli by Penny Dolan and Nick Sharratt. Mr. Pod lives in a flat with Todd, his fat ginger cat. He keeps himself to himself and he's happy with that, until Todd goes missing. Mr. Piccalilli lives in a flat with Millie, his fine white cat. He keeps himself to himself and he's happy with that, until Millie goes missing. Mr. Pod and Mr. Piccalilli by Penny Dolan and Nick Sharratt. Mr. Pod lived in a first-floor flat. He lived all alone and kept himself to himself. But he did have a cat. Mr. Piccalilli lived in a ground-floor flat. He lived all alone and kept himself to himself. But he did have a cat. Mr. Pod called his cat Todd. Mr. Pod loved Todd. Mr. Piccalilli called his cat Millie. Mr. Piccalilli loved Millie. One morning, Todd went missing. Mr. Pod searched high and low. One morning, Millie went missing. Mr. Piccalilli searched high and low. "Where are you, Todd? Where are you, Millie? Todd, where are you? Millie, where are you?" Mr. Pod asked at every flat, but no one had seen Todd. "Oh dear, have you seen my cat, Mr. Piccalilli?" But Mr. Piccalilli had not. "Have you seen my cat, Mr. Piccalilli?" Mr. Piccalilli asked at every flat, but no one had seen Millie. "Oh dear, have you seen my cat, Mr. Pod?" But Mr. Pod had not. "Have you seen my cat, Mr. Pod?" Mr. Pod sat in his flat and was sad. Mr. Piccalilli must be feeling sad too, he thought. Mr. Piccalilli sat in his flat and was sad. Mr. Pod must be feeling sad too, he thought. Mr. Pod decided to bake a cheering up cake for Mr. Piccalilli. Mr. Piccalilli decided to bake a cheering up cake for Mr. Pod. Mr. Pod was carrying his cake downstairs when suddenly he heard meow, 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 meow. Mr. Piccalilli was carrying his cake upstairs when suddenly he heard meow, 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 meow. And out of the landing cupboard came Todd and Millie and 6 little kittens. Mr. Pod and Mr. Piccalilli jumped for joy. They ate lots of cake to celebrate. After that, Mr. Pod and Mr. Piccalilli became best friends. Sometimes Millie and Todd and the 6 little kittens played in Mr. Pod's flat, and sometimes they played in Mr. Piccalilli's flat. And most times, everyone was happy.